This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, we submit Philip Roth's notorious novel Portnoy's Complaint to examination with academic and writer Matthew Shipe. Portnoy's Complaint is structured as a monologue to a psychotherapist. Alex Portnoy reveals his inner life and obsessions, including his sexual predilections, his strange relationship with his mother, and his attendant feelings of shame. If the novel's themes are shocking, Anthony Burgess praises Roth's great literary skill to make so fierce a theme the occasion for such uproarious comedy. Philip Roth was born in New Jersey in 1933. His first book was the story collection Goodbye Columbus, which was released in 1959. He went on to write 28 novels including The Human Stain, The Plot Against America, and American Pastoral, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1997. Throughout most of his career, he taught comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania. He died in 2018. Matthew Shipe is a teaching professor in the English department at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the author of Understanding Philip Roth and the editor, with Scott Dill, of the collection Updike and Politics, Due Considerations. In 2015, he won the John Updike Review's Emerging Writers Prize for his essay, The Long Goodbye, the role of memory in John Updike's short fiction. From 2016 to 2024, he served as the president of the Philip Roth Society. He currently serves as the co-executive editor of Philip Roth Studies and is on the executive board of the John Updike Society. For all the relevant links, head to the description of this episode, where you can also find a list of the books mentioned. I'm Graham Foster, and I spoke to Matthew Shipe about Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth in July 2025. Matthew, thanks for joining us on the 99 Novels podcast. Really excited to talk to you about Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth and Philip Roth more generally. First, we like to get a feel for the novel before we go deeper into the discussion. So I wonder if you can describe the novel to someone who hasn't read it.
Sure. And it's an unusual book and a kind of notorious book in a lot of ways. I think for a reader who's never read it, it takes the form of a psychoanalytic session between a patient, Alexander Portnoy, and his psychiatrist. It's a freewheeling book in that sense. Alex Portnoy is on the outside a very successful professional, on the inside struggling with fears of his parents, of his anxieties about his Jewishness, and also sexual questions too, which is probably why the book is as infamous or notorious as it is. But the book itself lacks the sort of plot that we expect novels to have. It lacks the sort of form that we expect most novels to have. It is sort of freewheeling in its associations as Alex is talking to his psychotherapist, who is silent until the very end of the novel. So it's a novel that is unconventional in a lot of ways in terms of its narrative form, in terms of its lack of plot. It is one driven by the main character, the protagonist, Alexander Portnoy's memories of his childhood and his adolescence and his relationships. It's a book all about shame, but it's shameless in terms of how Alex is talking about his parents, about his life, about his sexual appetites. It's uncensored in that way, in the way that a good psychoanalytic session is supposed to be. It's a novel that is, reflecting of that heyday of heyday of Freud, heyday of psychoanalysis. So it's is reflective of that sort of form and of that sort of lack of restraint in terms of what it's talking about, in terms of its subject matter.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably talk about the frankness of the narrative a bit later on. But when did you first discover the novel? Was Roth one of the authors that you discovered at an early age? And what did you first make of it when you read it?
That's a really wonderful question. And I'm probably slightly unusual in this regard. I'd read a little Roth in high school. I think just a couple of the stories in Goodbye Columbus, Defender of Faith and Conversion of the Jews. But it wasn't until college, towards the end of my college, I was an English major, where we read Roth and we read American Pastoral. And the book had just come out and it was published in 97. And in a sense, that was my real introduction to Roth. And in a sense, I kind of came at Roth in a way that's probably, again, slightly different than the average Roth reader, in that I was introduced to kind of Roth during his renaissance during the 1990s. And he's writing really a kind of a series of critically very successful and narratively very ambitious novels that engage with questions of American history. That was my introduction to Roth. And so I kind of went back and started picking up the new Roth books as they came out. I Married a Communist, Demon Stain. And then I went back and read, I think, Operation Shylock and Sabbath Theater. So I think I'd read a good bit of Roth before I finally picked up Portnoy's Complaint, and my sense of it being his sort of commercial breakthrough, and a sense of a breakthrough of voice. But I was already very familiar with Roth, and in a sense with the book's reputation before I picked it up.
That's really interesting because the book's reputation, I think, ever since I started getting into literature, and American literature was my specialist subject at university, I guess. I did my PhD in 1990s American literature, and the reputation of Portnoy, as soon as you even break the surface of American literature, is very apparent right from the get-go, really. And weirdly, this is the first time I've read it, and like you, I read the later books, Plot Against America, that sort of thing. And going back to Portnoy after reading those, which are very critically acclaimed, and Portnoy is, shall we say, its critical reputation is a little more contested than his later books. So it was a shock, really, to read something so seemingly free and uncontrolled, where the later books are like a master at work, aren't they?
Yeah.
Back to Portnoy, I think we'll talk about its reception a little later on, but the novel, as you say, is basically a monologue, Alex Portnoy talking to his therapist. And since its publication, most readers, I would say, including Burgess in his review in 99 Novels, see the novel as a piece of autobiographical fiction. Does that reading of the novel hold up to any scrutiny? And how is Roth playing with the idea of fact versus fiction in the novel?
I think that's again a great question. I think the key word is Roth is very much interested in playing with that line between fact and fiction. And it's a line that he'll play with in his subsequent novels too, especially the early Zuckerman books. But in Portnoy's, when it was coming out, there was a story where he shipped his parents off to tour of Europe because he had a sense that the book was going to be a success, but it was also going to bring a lot of notoriety. And the sort of question is he writing about his parents? Is he writing about himself? So he kind of sent them off on I think, a cruise to Europe to let them escape. And he talks about the facts. I think his dad signing books, signing Portnoy's as Portnoy's father. So he was definitely very much aware of that and interested in playing. Again, I think playing is the key word. Playing with readers' sort of desire to identify Alex Portnoy with his creator. Now, Roth is very careful to disclaim that he's not writing about himself, not writing about his parents necessarily, but he's certainly always interested in inviting that sort of misreading and playing with readers' expectations or desires to want to identify Alex Portnoy as just a thin disguise for Philip Roth. That being said, there are, of course, similarities between Alex Portnoy and Roth. And again, Roth does this quite deliberately. The Newark childhood, the sort of way in which both the idyllic nature of that home versus its sort of constraints are depicted in ways that are familiar with anyone who's read any Roth or is aware of his background.
Did he ever talk about how his parents received the novel? Did they read it?
Yes, they read it, and there's some nice interviews with him and with his parents talking about the book. And they're very much the kind of typical proud parent, especially his father, of the book and its reception. And Roth would kind of joke on this or riff on this in later works. There's a series of books with a character called Nathan Zuckerman, who's again another very sort of thinly disguised, even more thinly disguised. He's a writer version of Roth in a book called Zuckerman Unbound. Roth is really rethinking the success and notoriety of Portnoy, and that character Zuckerman writes a book similar to Portnoy's style book called Karnofsky. And he's recognized on the streets of New York and confused for the character all the time. So, I mean, this is an idea that Roth was very aware of and gleefully brought back into his fiction in ways that, again, address all these sort of ways in which I think Roth is kind of wanting to have his cake and eat it too. On the one hand, this is fiction and it is not the self. On the other hand, I want to always be kind of calling your attention to the ways in which it is a representation or to a certain degree, a version of myself.
Do you think he's sort of catching the truth of his upbringing rather than the actual facts of it, maybe? Or
I mean, it's sort of that, I think. If it's not an accurate representation, it is at least, in a sense, the fiction, I think, brings that material alive in the way that when Roth writes about his childhood and adolescence in a book, a memoir called The Facts, it's very sort of dry in a sense. So I think there's a way in which the fiction animates things, in a sense, realer than the actual biography itself. If that makes sense. That may be getting a little too postmodernly.
Burgess did the same sort of thing with elements of his life, although he's a rare example of his autobiography being sort of a riot to read. Whether or not it's true, we'll never know, I suppose. But speaking of Burgess, he indicates the novel was made possible because of the Lady Chatterley trial in 1960, and he delights in its uproarious comedy. That's a quote from the review.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, there's no getting around the explicit nature of the book and the bawdy nature of the book. It's quite strong. There's no hiding. As you say, it's a monologue to his therapist. So Portnoy is being completely open. Today's audiences may not respond the same way Burgess did, but it seems to me kind of unfair to historicize the novel and say, oh, it's a piece of its time, or, you know, it minimizes it somehow. But what do you think the case is for the relevance of Portnoy's complaint today?
Again, a great question. And you're right. There's a sort of way in which I think you can try to you minimize a book by just saying it's a product of its time, that it's a product of sexual revolution or interest in Freud and psychoanalysis that was very much part of mid-century American culture. And it's hard, when I've taught the book, it's hard to recoup what was so shocking and so different about the book when it was published in 1969. I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but I mean, for Roth, it really was a breakthrough in terms of voice and narrative technique. And it was a sort of breaking free of the shackles and the constraints of what Roth thought serious literature could look at and could discuss. And before the later Chatterley trial, that book could not have been published a decade earlier in the United States. So it's very much a product of that. That said, I think it's still quite a relevant book in terms of its discussion of sexuality, of the self, of memory. You noted that Alex Portnoy as a character, in a sense, is free, and he is. He's uncensored when he's talking to his therapist, but he's also performing for the therapist, I think, in certain ways, too. He is kind of constantly aware of that audience who is listening and not speaking. So, it's an interesting book in terms of how we think about how we perform selves and construct our identities. What's funny is a book that so many people describe as funny, and the parts of it I think are uproarious. But every time I've taught it to undergraduates, it's a book that they really have difficulty finding the humor in, and I think that's partially because Roth is so politically incorrect in that novel, and so sort of shameless in talking about masturbation and talking about sex. But it is surprising that it's a hard book to explain when you're not laughing at the bits that you think people are going to laugh at. So that being said, I do think it's a book that's worth continuing to read, not only as a sort of historical document, but as a sort of serious meditation on how we construct and perform identities, and the sort of constraints that Alex is facing, questions of sexual identity, masculinity, but also questions of sort of Americanness, or questions that are quite relevant today.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I know what you mean when you talk about, is Alex being open or is he performing? The sex in the novel seems to be caught somewhere between sort of titillating or boasting and deeply shameful. And he's embarrassed about the way he treats women in some respects, but he's also boasting about it. It's a very complicated characterization, I think.
It's also sort of couched in a strong degree of self-loathing that he's quite aware of too. What he calls his obsession with Gentile women. I mean, at one point, he basically says he's trying to screw his way into America. So there's a great sense of sort of self-loathing that's propelling his narrative that kind of runs throughout the text.
A lot of the more extreme elements of the novel, you've talked about masturbation. There's very explicit descriptions of sex. There are other things as well. The language is quite free for something written in 1969. There doesn't seem to be any self-censorship as Portnoy is telling his story, or self-censorship in that way where he's trying to be polite, at least. Roth likened Portnoy's complaint to the style of comedy that Lenny Bruce pioneered, and Lenny Bruce was another person who pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in his own art form. How useful is this comparison, specifically the comparison with Lenny Bruce and the comparison to stand-up comedy more generally?
I think that's an interesting comparison. And I've seen Roth both kind of, as you say, invite that comparison with Lenny Bruce. And then there's another interview where I think when he's asked about that, he says, well, no, I was inspired by a comedian named Kafka, right? So on the one hand, I think he would invite that comparison. But on the other hand, I think he was also very much trying to broaden what could be considered serious literature. So on the one hand, there is that sort of riffing and that sort of not only obscenity, but just sort of playfulness and circular nature of how Alex is talking. That is very much a sort of not only a product of stand up, but really in terms of how Roth would talk with his friends. I mean, he talks about this in the facts that, in a sense, the real breakthrough for the novel and writing the novel was just capturing on the page the sort of jokes and the sort of voice that he would use when talking with his buddies, over a dinner party, if that makes sense, and bringing that and somehow recreating the very aliveness of that voice on the page. So on the one hand, I think it has that sort of similarity with stand up, and I think you can certainly see Lenny Bruce and Portnoy's Complaint as belonging in the sort of similar spectrum of American comedy, and how the desire to censor comedy kind of fell apart in the 60s. But on the other hand, I think Roth would always be sort of wary of identifying it simply as that sort of comedy. He's more interested in being seen in the book, sort of expanding what in his mind literature could do, rather than just seeing it as a sort of stand-up routine.
Yeah, and you mentioned Kafka there, and Roth cites Kafka as an influence and was reading a lot of Kafka and teaching Kafka, I think, around the time he wrote Portnoy's Complaint. Can you tell us a little bit more about the influence of Kafka? Because it sounds quite surprising, given the extremity of Portnoy's Complaint and the seeming freedom of Portnoy's Complaint. Kafka strikes me as a much more controlled writer. Can you say something about that influence?
Sure. I'll actually back it up a step, because I think to understand Portnoy's Complaint, you have to understand Roth's earlier fiction. He had had great acclaim with his debut collection, Goodbye Columbus, which is a novella and a series of short stories. But his first two novels after that, Letting Go and When She Was Good, are very much Roth writing to what he saw as his American literary tradition. Letting Go is a book that is steeped in Henry James. It's a very serious book in that way. And When She Was Good is kind of Roth's take on bleaker late 19th century, early 20th century American realism, Theodore Dreiser, people like that. So it's not till Portnoy that he kind of figures it out that, to bring his fiction alive, he needs to have the sort of break free of that sort of constraint. And I think Kafka, while you don't feel Kafka as much in Portnoy's directly, I think that ability to break with literary form, to break with a certain sort of American tradition that he was very much, I think, invested in as a graduate student at the University of Chicago and then throughout his early books. I think Kafka is one of the things that helps him get there. And certainly in the books he writes right after Portnoy's complaint. I'm thinking of The Breast, which is not probably anyone's ideal starting point for Roth. It's about a professor who turns into a female breast. And it's a riff on Kafka to a large extent. And another essay slash story, I Marry You for Your Fasting, in which Roth writes this really smart essay on Kafka and then imagines Kafka having survived and moved to New Jersey, where he marries, I think, a family member of Roth's. So he has Kafka on the mind a lot in the late 60s and the early 70s. It comes out in that story, and it comes out in The Breast. And yeah, you feel it, and I think in the terms of the sort of form and, in a sense, even maybe that interest in shame. I want to be careful in talking about Portnoy because I think Alex Portnoy is a character. While he's uncensored, he's a character deeply controlled by a shame. I think that's something that Roth gets from Kafka.
Portnoy's Complaint is a very free and riotous book, but it's also very claustrophobic. The voice is hermetically sealed. It's Portnoy. You can't get away from Portnoy, and you're trapped with him in the sort of prison of his own making, really. So Kafka is there, I guess.
Yes, yes. First of all, I love your description of it as claustrophobic. There's so many passages where he's in all caps. He's kind of screaming at us, and it can be a bit of a suffocating novel in that way. But it's also, I mean, Alex is a character kind of trapped in his own shame and his own anxieties in a lot of ways, and he's self-aware to see, to a certain extent, the trap he's created for himself. But the therapy, in a sense, is not getting him anywhere. So the novel's last line is the therapist, Dr. Spielvogel. Sorry for the spoiler. Now we perhaps begin, all right, the sort of notion that Alex is still not really getting anywhere by the end of 300 pages.
Yeah, I also took that as a sort of premature ejaculation joke.
Yes, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of the literary significance of Portnoy, it reminded me very much of a novel you may have come across. I think the author was at your university, taught at your university. Is The Tunnel by William Gass.
Oh yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Portnoy reminded me. I read The Tunnel before Portnoy's Complaint, and I think The Tunnel is much longer, much more complex, but it's still a hermetically sealed voice you're trapped with, who is being very or seemingly very honest about his life. And I think the DNA of Portnoy's Complaint is all over something like The Tunnel. But can you tell me what you think the literary significance of Portnoy's Complaint is? Maybe what it was in the 60s. You've talked about that a bit, but certainly what the literary significance of it is today.
Sure. In terms of the 60s, I think it belongs with books like John Updike's Couples and Erica Young's Fear of Flying, and perhaps some Norman Mailer too, in terms of books that really sort of open up what it is that you can talk about, and very much sort of reflections of ways in which the sexual revolution and the political upheavals and cultural upheavals of the 60s really reshaped mid-century American culture. In terms of its reputation today, I think it's sort of ways in which it grapples with issues of sexual identity, masculinity. In a sense, I don't think Roth's being uncritical in Portnoy's Complaint. Roth gets the sort of charge of misogyny, and I certainly understand that in a lot of ways. But there's also a strong degree of indictment of Alex throughout the book, especially in its last third. That last section in Israel is really a problematic sort of moment within the narrative where Alex encounters an Israeli woman and he attempts to sexually assault her and she ends up beating him up. We're not meant to sort of valorize Alex Portnoy's masculinity, I think. I think there is a sort of strong degree of interrogating what produces an Alex Portnoy and interrogating, in a sense, the sort of consequences of an Alex Portnoy.
All the way through the novel, there are scenes where Alex, I don't know if it's revealing his true self, but he certainly reveals his bad behavior. And the way it's written, I don't think you're meant to be on Alex's side as he's being horrible to women. There's another that earlier on in the novel, there's a girl that he basically stalks, who he goes ice skating with once, and he basically stalks her. There's sort of scenes like that, but I don't think a sensitive reader, at least, or a sensible reader, would really think Alex is the hero of the novel, the hero of these situations, at least.
I think Roth hopes his readers will be savvy enough to sort of pick up on that sort of critique.
Again, it was that sort of thing that reminded me of The Tunnel by William Gass. His narrator is an overt misogynist. He could be a Nazi. He's almost certainly a rapist. He's a very, very horrible character, but he's extremely charming in the way the novel is written. And you're complicit in his bad behavior, his crimes, because you enjoy the poetic writing, you enjoy the charm. And there's some of that going on in Portnoy, I think. You enjoy the humor, but, it doesn't take away from the fact that Alex is a compromised character, to put it mildly.
Yes, and you're right. I think the thing that's so wonderful about Portnoy, and actually, again, another reason why it's still a very important book is the voice of that book is just so remarkable, I think. And so different than late Roth, which is, in a sense, much more serious and controlled. But Portnoy's on a sort of craft level, if you're thinking about why you read this or why you teach it, I think it's such a wonderful example of creating such an alive voice. And again, part of that aliveness is the way in which it's sort of performing and exposing Alex's flaws.
In that respect, there's the possibility, as we talked about earlier, that it could also be exposing Roth's own flaws, and he must be aware of that. It's quite a brave piece of writing if you consider that you can't control the audience, how the audience is going to read it. So Roth is really putting himself on the line, even if it's all complete fiction in a way.
Yes, yes. But he talks about the experience of writing the book as being sort of exhilarating. He was, I think, quite aware of the riskiness of what he was doing, in a sense. Beyond even just sort of breaking through his literary sort of inspirations, it's coming out of a moment where Roth himself had gone through years of analysis. There's a good joke where he talks about, did analysis do anything for you? He's like, not really as a person, but as a writer, yes. So, but also he's coming off a first marriage. His first wife dies in a car accident in New York City. It was a relationship that it was, I think, very sort of toxic for Roth, and her death, in a sense, plays into sort of what he felt as the sort of liberating factors of came pouring out of Portnoy's complaint.
We've talked quite a bit about positioning the novel today in the 60s. One of the ways that it has been positioned in the past by critics is as a piece of Jewish writing, often lumped together with people like Bellow. I mean, it is without a doubt about the Jewish experience of living in America. But when the novel came out, the reception of the novel by Jewish critics was quite harsh, wasn't it? There were accusations of anti-Semitism, and Roth was accused of self-hatred. I've got a quote from a reviewer here called Maria Sirkin, saying that Portnoy's complaint was, and this is a quote, straight from the Goebbels Stryker script, which is quite strong. What did Roth make of those critiques? And a sort of larger question, what was his relationship to his own Jewish identity? What did these criticisms make him feel about his own Jewish identity?
I think it's a complex, difficult question in a lot of ways. I mean, Roth first runs afoul of the Jewish community from the outset of his career. The stories in Goodbye Columbus, particularly Defender of the Faith, which appears in the New Yorker, and it's a story about Jewish U.S. Army officers during the tail end of the Second World War, and it leads to a lot of charges that you just actually repeated with Portnoy's complaint of kind of Jewish self-hatred. So by the time Roth actually gets to, and Roth is just sort of outraged, when he gets to Portnoy's complaint, he knows exactly what he's doing. So if the stories in Goodbye Columbus got these sort of charges of Jewish self-hatred, then he knows exactly that those readers are going to find Portnoy's complaint a billion times worse. So in a sense, I think he's being very sort of provocative, very purposefully provocative in terms of how he's engaging and, in a sense, trying to enrage that readership. I think more broadly, it fits into Roth, the sort of question of how fiction and literature is read. And the reason I say that is Roth restages these sort of questions and these sort of charges of Jewish self-hatred and anti-Semitism in a later book called The Ghostwriter, which comes out 10 years after Portnoy's complaint. And in that book, a young writer, Nathan Zuckerman, gets all these sort of charges, the same sort of blowback that you're describing with Portnoy's complaint. And the argument that Zuckerman makes in that book, and I think it's the argument that a young Roth would make, is that fiction is its own thing. There's a sort of sanctity to fiction that should enable it to be free in the way that Roth thinks it should be free. To write about any human beings in a sort of realistic and meaningful way is to capture them in all their sort of absurdities and in all their foibles and flaws. I think when he's writing Portnoy's complaint, he's got the sort of charges and complaints that he had in mind that he received with Goodbye Columbus, and is basically, if you thought Goodbye Columbus was offensive, your eyes are gonna pop out of your socket when you read Portnoy's complaint. So I think he's just very, very aware of what he's doing. I think throughout his career, Roth had a sort of ambivalent relationship with his own identification as a Jewish American writer. He writes some essays late in his career, making the argument he makes at the outset that he wants to be read as an American writer. Even though some of his people he's writing inspired most by, I mean, the generation that's slightly older than him, Saul Bellow in particular, and Malamud also, he's aware of that sort of trajectory of Jewish American literature. He doesn't want to be necessarily confined to that section of the bookstore or the library in terms of how he's classified. In terms of his own sort of notion of himself, on the one hand, Roth was always a very explicit atheist in terms of how he talked about religion. On the other hand, I think he was also someone who was connected with a sort of sense of Jewish identity. It comes out in a book where, especially, I'm sorry, I'm referencing a lot of later Roth, The Counterlife, where again, the character of Zuckerman grapples with the notion of what it means to be a Jew. He feels most Jewish actually not when he moves to England with his new British wife.
We've talked quite a lot about Portnoy, but in terms of Roth's career more generally, we've talked about how different his later books are to his writing in the 60s. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, Roth was one of only 3 living writers ever to be added so far to the Library of America, which was a huge honor. But his reputation as a writer has gone up and down, probably more than any writer that I can think of. And I wonder, how do you think Roth's work is viewed today more generally outside of Portnoy?
I mean, I think Roth's career is sort of fascinating in the sense that he's one of the few writers that I can think of whose really reputation stands on the later work. I mean, I think Roth would be remembered if his career stops with Portnoy's, but he's certainly, what got him into the Library of America wasn't Portnoy's, but really was the great critical run that starts in the mid 1980s with The Counterlife and runs really throughout The Plot Against America, where Roth's novels really are narratively most ambitious and thematically richer, if that makes sense, in terms of their engagement with larger questions of history and American politics. In terms of how he's read today, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think that sort of question kind of came really to the forefront when Blake Bailey's biography was published shortly after Roth's death, and the controversy that surrounded Bailey, where he was accused of sexual accusations that led the book to be pulled. In a sense, that Bailey scandal somehow got connected to this question of what is Roth's legacy, or will Roth continue to be read? And I think Roth's legacy has actually weathered that quite well. What strikes me, and again, what I think makes Roth, especially late Roth, very timely, is his late work is all about what he calls the terrible unforeseen of history. Most famously in The Plot Against America, which imagines a sort of counter history in which Lindbergh wins the presidency and over FDR and leads America in a sort of fascist direction. Certainly, these sort of fears of where America is headed has been very sort of timely. books like The Plot Against America, or even Nemesis, his final novel, which is, again, a sort of counter history, which imagines a polio epidemic decimating Newark in the 1940s. And books that like that have unfortunately been quite sort of relevant with the rise of Trump, and then there's also the COVID pandemic, in a sense, have made Roth, in a sense, feel more timely than ever, I think.
With my own work in American literature, I was researching writers of primarily of the 90s, but some of the 80s as well. And there seemed to be with these writers a will to reject Roth in the same way, not Roth particularly, but Roth as part of the previous generation, really. So writers like David Foster Wallace, for example, would sort of shun Roth in essays and that sort of thing. He would also shun people like John Updike in his essays. And so when I was researching these 90s authors, Roth didn't seem particularly relevant at that point in time. But what is his literary legacy now? Are there writers today that are working in his shadow that are influenced by him?
Sure. And you mentioned that David Foster Wallace piece. I think what he's called him, the great white male narcissist. And one of Wallace's good friends, Jonathan Franzen, had to sort of come around on Roth, where I think he shared the sort of concerns that Wallace exposes in that essay, or charged levels in that essay. Has come around in later years to being a proponent of Roth in ways that are surprising for a writer of his generation. But in terms of Roth's influence today, yeah, I definitely think you feel Roth. I mean, certainly in a writer like Nicole Cross, who kind of rewrites the counterlife in a book called Forest Lake. I can't quite recall the title of the novel. Gary Steingart, I think, is a writer who also, in terms of his humor and his outrageousness, seems propelled by Roth to a certain extent. Ayad Akhtar, in a book called American Elegies, references Roth and is very Rothian in terms of how he makes himself a character within the narrative itself. I do think you feel Roth's influence kind of continued, probably more so in this generation of writers than, say, in the generation that directly followed, which, the Wallace generation and Franzen's. I do think you see certain writers like Cross and like Akhtar, and certainly even a recent novel like Garth Greenwell, Small Rain. Very serious book, but a book that, again, in ways in which it presents the self, seems very much influenced by Roth. So I do think you feel his influence a bit more fully. And another writer that comes to mind is, say, Jonathan Lethem. In certain works, Letham's a very sort of different writer in a lot of ways, but in books like Dissident Gardens, where he's engaging with questions of not only Jewish identity, but also sort of American history, feels very sort of Rothian to me.
Yeah, Lethem is sort of halfway between the Wallace era and what has come after today, I suppose. And we should say it's very natural for the next generation to reject the generation that
Correct.
went
Yeah.
before. So it's, not necessarily a criticism of Roth that these writers didn't want anything to do with him. You've already given us a massive reading list in this podcast, but our final question is always the same. And if you could add 100th novel to Burgess's list, what would it be and why?
I loved reading the list. Thank you for sharing that. It was a fantastic list. I'm going to go with contemporary of Roth, John Updike's Rabbit is Rich, which is the third book in the Rabbit tetralogy. He has an Updike book on the list, The Coup, which is a strange book for him to pick. I like The Coup, but it's not necessarily the best representation of Updike. I love Rabbit is Rich. Is coming out of the Jimmy Carter era. I think Updike just does a wonderful job of cataloging American experience in the Rabbit novels in general, but in that book in particular, his sense of that sort of lower middle class, kind of middle American sort of life, I think is just pitch perfect in that book. And it's a book, again, that's all about a sort of American entropy. I think America sort of running out of gas. It's both a sort of wonderful document and portrait of its time, but also a book that remains sort of lively and exposes flaws about America and the American dream and masculinity and middle class American life. And Updike I'm a sucker for his prose, and I think his prose is just at its best in a book like that.
That's a really interesting choice. I've read Run Rabbit, the first one. I haven't gone further in that yet. There's always too much to read. But thanks for adding it to our bedside tables anyway. Thanks also for talking to us about Portnoy's Complaint and Philip Roth. It's been really fascinating to hear more about it in a time when it's not talked about all that much. So thank you for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed our conversation quite a bit.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Understanding Philip Roth by Matthew Shipe is out now. For more information about Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can subscribe to the Burgess Foundation's free weekly newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com.